It is said that in the old days when spring would return with a quiet breath over the lands of Persia, a wandering dervish named Yunis was seen once again on the dusty roads leading toward the gardens and courtyards of Shiraz, as if drawn by an invisible memory rather than any destination of the body, and the old men of Shiraz still remember how the wind itself seemed to soften when he approached, though nothing miraculous ever occurred, only the natural world, becoming briefly more attentive as if listening. The narrator of this tale, as it has been passed from one traveler to another, speaks not of wonder but of quiet endurance, for dervish Yunis was not a man of spectacle, but of pauses, of silences between words, of footsteps measured against the passing of time. It is said he came every spring to Shiraz not to seek wealth or companionship in any direct way, but to sit near the home of an old poet, who had long since stopped writing verses, yet still kept ink and paper as one keeps the memory of a lost voice. This poet, whose name has faded in some accounts but whose presence remains like the scent of dried roses in old books, was known for having once written lines that made young men weep and old women remember their youth without pain. Now, in his final years, he waited not for inspiration, but for spring itself, as though the season carried within it a permission to feel again. Travelers once spoke of a wandering dervish who would sit across from his courtyard gate without knocking, simply arriving as if he had always been expected. And there he would remain in quiet companionship with the poet, neither asking nor explaining, only existing within the same slow rhythm of breath and memory. Soft music of a distant stringed instrument is said to have drifted through those afternoons, not performed for an audience, but played by a young neighbor who believed that sound, like wind, should not be held too tightly. The dervish would sometimes close his eyes, not in prayer as others understood it, but in a form of listening that had no direction, as if the world itself were speaking in a language older than words. The poet, meanwhile, would sit by his window and observe him through half-drawn curtains, studying not the man but the stillness he carried, as one studies the surface of water for reflections that never fully form. It is said that neither ever spoke of faith or philosophy, for such matters would have broken the delicate balance of their meetings, and instead they shared small gestures, a cup of tea left cooling, a piece of bread divided without comment, a nod that contained entire conversations never spoken aloud. The old men of Shiraz still remember that spring was different in those years, not brighter or more beautiful, but heavier with meaning, as if time itself slowed down in the presence of quiet understanding. Yunis was not always a dervish. Some say he was once a scribe in distant cities. Others claim he had been a student of music, but no version of his past remains certain, and perhaps that is why his presence in Shiraz feels so complete, as though he had shed all definitions before arriving. The poet, too, had once been young and full of words, but age had softened him into silence that was not emptiness but fullness without expression. Between them there grew a kind of companionship that required no declaration, a shared acceptance that life does not always resolve itself into meaning, but sometimes only into presence. One spring afternoon, when the light over the courtyard walls turned the color of pale honey, the poet finally spoke a sentence, though it was not addressed directly to the dervish, but rather to the air between them, saying that he no longer remembered whether he had written poetry to capture life or to escape it. The dervish did not answer, yet something in his posture shifted slightly, as if acknowledging that the question itself was enough and needed no reply. Outside, the streets of Shiraz continued their ordinary rhythm, merchants calling softly in the bazaar, children chasing each other near fountains, and the scent of bread rising from clay ovens, all unchanged by the quiet encounter hidden within the courtyard. It is said that as evening approached, Yunis would rise without ceremony, adjust his worn cloak, and walk away along the same road he had come from, leaving no trace, except a faint impression of having listened deeply. The poet would remain by his window long after, watching the empty path, not with longing exactly, but with a stillness that resembled understanding. And so the spring of that year passed as all springs do, carrying within it the memory of two men who had learned in their own separate ways that waiting is sometimes the most honest form of living, and that silence when shared can become heavier than speech, yet gentler than regret. It is said that in the following spring, when the almond trees once again opened their pale blossoms along the edges of Shiraz, dervish Yunis returned as he always did. Though no one ever saw him arrive, only noticed that he was suddenly there, seated near the familiar courtyard, where the old poet now spent most of his days in quiet decline, as if time had begun to sit more heavily upon his shoulders. The narrator of this account recalls how the air that year felt unchanged in its outward form, yet somehow more fragile, as though even ordinary sounds, footsteps in the alley, the distant call of a vendor, the rustle of cloth in the wind, had become aware of their own passing. The poet had grown weaker, his hands less steady, his eyes more often resting on things, rather than reading them, and yet he still kept the habit of placing ink on paper each morning, though few lines were ever completed. When Yunis arrived he did not speak as was his way, but the poet seemed to sense him without turning, as if recognition had moved beyond sight and settled into something deeper, something closer to memory than perception. It is said that on certain afternoons, when the light fell softly through the courtyard vines, the poet would begin to speak in fragments, not poems exactly, but remnants of thought that had once been poetry. Speaking of a river he had seen in his youth where the water carried away more than reflections, speaking of a love that had ended not in sorrow, but in quiet disappearance, and speaking of how every city eventually becomes a memory, even for those who still live within its walls. Yunis listened without interruption, his presence unchanged, and though he rarely moved, there was in him a still attentiveness that made each word feel as if it had found its only proper listener. The old men of Shiraz still say that no one understood why the dervish came each year, but some believed he was not there for the poet alone, but for something that existed between them, something neither could name but both sustained through their shared silence. One evening, as the call to prayer drifted faintly through the air and the sky above Shiraz turned the color of faded copper, the poet asked a question more directly than he ever had before, not to the air this time, but toward Yunis himself, asking whether a man could spend his life searching and still arrive too late at what he was meant to find. The dervish did not answer immediately, and when he finally spoke his words were simple, almost ordinary, saying only that arrival and departure are often the same moment seen from different sides of the heart, and then he fell silent again as if he had said more than enough. The poet closed his eyes at that, not in agreement or disagreement, but in recognition of something he had long suspected but never dared to shape into thought. In the days that followed the poet grew quieter, and his mornings became shorter, yet he still waited by the window, as if the act of waiting itself had become more meaningful than what was being awaited. Yunis remained present, though no one could say for how long at a time, as his appearances seemed to belong less to clock or calendar, and more to the natural rhythm of fading light. It is said that once, a young boy passing through the courtyard saw the two men sitting in silence, and assumed they were strangers who had nothing to do with each other, and yet he felt reluctant to disturb them, as if their silence formed a kind of boundary that should not be crossed. That same evening the poet spoke no words at all, only placed a small cup of tea on the stone ledge beside Yunis, who acknowledged it with a slight lowering of his head, and in that gesture, according to those who remember, there was an entire conversation that no language could have improved. As night settled over Shiraz, the courtyard filled with the scent of damp earth and fading blossoms, and somewhere beyond the walls life continued its ordinary course, unaware that within that small space two aging lives were slowly moving toward the same quiet understanding that nothing essential is ever truly spoken, only briefly shared, and then released back into the silence from which it came. It is said that when the final spring came softer than the ones before it, as if even the season itself had begun to understand, restrained dervish Yunis arrived once more in Shiraz, though by then the old poet was rarely seen outside his room, and the courtyard that once held their silent companionship had begun to feel like an empty page waiting for a final line that might never be written. The narrator of this tale recalls how the wind that year carried the scent of distant rain, even when the sky was clear, and how the city seemed to move with a gentler hesitation, as though aware that something unspoken was nearing its completion. The poet, now very near the end of his days, no longer attempted to write at all, yet he kept his ink and paper close, not out of hope, but out of habit, as one keeps a mirror even after forgetting the face it once reflected. When Yunis entered the courtyard, no one announced him, as no one ever had, but the poet, sensing his presence, asked to be brought to the window, where he could see the place where so many quiet afternoons had once passed between them. It is said that for a long moment neither man moved, and even the air between them seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to continue carrying sound or surrender entirely to silence. The poet then spoke his final words with great effort, not as poetry, but as something more fragile than poetry, saying that he had spent his life trying to hold moments in language. Yet what he now understood was that nothing can be held, only remembered, and even memory changes its shape with time. Yunis listened as always, and though his expression did not change, those who later spoke of him said that his stillness had deepened not into sadness but into acceptance, as if the words had reached a place within him where response was no longer necessary. The poet's breath grew slower, and he rested his hand on the window ledge, as if feeling the stone for the last time, and in that simple gesture there was more farewell than any spoken goodbye could contain. Outside, the streets of Shiraz continued their ordinary life, a baker opening his oven, a merchant counting coins, a child chasing shadows along a wall. And yet within the courtyard time itself seemed to thin, as though it were becoming less certain of its own direction. It is said that the poet passed away not in dramatic silence, but in the quiet completion of breath, as naturally as evening becomes night, and that Yunis remained seated long after, not as a mourner in the usual sense, but as one who understands that departure does not require witnessing to be real. When at last he rose, he did not look back, for there was nothing left that required looking, and he walked through the narrow streets of Shiraz, with the same unhurried step with which he had always arrived, carrying nothing visible except the weight of what had been shared and could no longer be spoken. The old men of Shiraz still say that after that spring, Yunis was seen less often in the city, and some believe he never returned again, while others claim that he still walks the old roads of Persia, not as a man seeking anything, but as one who has understood that seeking itself eventually becomes its own destination. And so the story ends not with an ending, but with a continuation carried into silence, as all true things eventually are, leaving only the echo of two lives that met each spring in a small courtyard, where nothing was changed outwardly, yet everything within the heart was quietly rearranged, and where even now in memory, it is said that waiting and presence are sometimes the same thing seen from different sides of time.